Coming up today, the United States confirms that Seoul and Washington have begun talks over the deployment of a highly sophisticated U.S. missile defense system to South Korea. Helped by other countries' shipments falling more amid the global economic downturn, South Korea jumped a notch to become the sixth largest exporter in the world last year. Plus, the United States calls for parties to halt the militarization of the South China Sea after satellite images appear to show that China has deployed missiles to a disputed island. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Thursday, the 18th of February. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Broom. We are going to start with news that North Korean leader Kim Jongun may have ordered the regime's military and intelligence agency to intensify preparations for terror attacks on South Korea. Citing information from South Korea's National Intelligence Service, the ruling Saenuri Party said North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau, responsible for cyber warfare and intelligence operations in foreign countries, is preparing to carry out cyber attacks, attacks using poison, or even kidnappings of South Korean citizens. The report was made today during an emergency security meeting between the government and ruling party. The government reported that the draft resolution on North Korea, currently in progress at the UN Security Council, is expected to be passed by the end of the month. Lawmakers at the National Assembly are firing questions at 14 government ministers as part of a regular audit of government affairs. Taking centre stage is the possible deployment of the US missile defence system called THAAD to the Korean peninsula and the government's decision to shut down the inter-Korean factory park in the North Korean border town of Kaesong. The main opposition Minju Party of Korea is expected to raise questions about the wisdom of deploying the missile defence system here. The ruling party has stated both the THAAD system and the Kaesong shutdown were inevitable. The two-day audit, focusing on foreign affairs, inter-Korean relations, national security and social welfare, started today and wraps up on Friday. Now, the United States has confirmed that defense officials from Seoul and Washington have begun consultations over the deployment of a missile defense system to South Korea. Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD as it's more commonly known, would act as an extra layer of protection from North Korea's missile threats. Let's get the details from our Kim Hyun-bin, who is standing by for us at the Ministry of National Defense in Seoul. Hyun-bin, we had been expecting an announcement this week, but we finally have some confirmation.
That's right, Mark. The Pentagon confirmed that the two allies joint working groups have started talks on the potential deployment of that to South Korea. Now, Bill Urban, the Pentagon spokesman, said officials will continue discussion, but there's no binding timetable. Now, in a briefing a little while ago, South Korea's defense ministry had a different take on when talks actually begun.
Official consultations on THAAD began on February 7th. The formation and management of the joint working group is still under discussion.
So there seems to be a mismatch on the progress made so far. We'll keep you updated if that develops. However, South Korea's Defense Minister Han Min-gu, speaking in Seoul on Thursday morning, said the THAAD system will be able to better protect South Korea. He emphasized that the talks will help the allies find the best location for a THAAD battery and one that doesn't affect the safety of local residents or the surrounding environment. And Minister Han also touched upon the annual South Korea-U.S. military drills that are set to start next month. He said this year's Key Resolve and Full Eagle exercise will be the largest ever given the current security situation, or more than twice the number of U.S. troops taking part than usual. 15,000 American soldiers will be involved, along with some of the most powerful pieces of hardware in the U.S. military's arsenal. Some 290,000 South Korean troops will take part in the drills that Seoul and Washington stress are purely defensive in nature. Back to you.
Thank you, Hyun-bin, for that report. Now, a South Korean presidential representative is in Washington to urge the U.S. to up the pressure on North Korea for its recent provocations. This comes as the UN Security Council is making steady progress on a new resolution against the regime, but whether China will be on board remains to be seen. Kwon Jang-ho with the details.
Cho Tae-yong, South Korea's Deputy Chief of the Presidential Office of National Security, is in Washington to meet with U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken, where he is expected to urge the U.S. to increase the pressure on North Korea in light of recent events.
The primary objective is to put North Korea in a situation where they have no option but to alter their course and to block the regime's nuclear and missile development.
Cho also said the UN Security Council is making progress on a new resolution that would put the strongest ever sanctions on North Korea, and that despite China's reported reservations, they are largely on board.
China is in agreement with South Korea and the U.S. that North Korea's fourth nuclear test is something that cannot be tolerated.
China's foreign minister, speaking earlier in the day in Beijing, said that while the country is open to discussing the UN Security Council resolution, reopening talks and maintaining peace should be the priority.
Hotspot issues in the world can't be solved through pressure or sanctions, let alone military means. That will only exacerbate the situation. The Chinese government always supports a political solution.
Wang went on to say that China will put forward a proposal to all parties for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and a truce to peace mechanism. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
Now, US President Barack Obama plans to say yes to a new bill broadening US sanctions on North Korea for its recent nuclear test and long-range missile launch. The White House confirmed on Wednesday that President Obama will sign the North Korea sanctions bill into law, upon which it will immediately come into effect. It did not say when that's going to happen, though. Now, the new bill was welcomed by South Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Im Sung-nam, who met with Congressman Robert Whitman on Wednesday in Seoul, saying it will send the right signal to Pyongyang. One of the strictest measures in the bill is the secondary boycott clause, which targets individuals or entities in third countries that have financial dealings with North Korea. Now, South Korea has moved up a notch to become the world's sixth largest exporter. It's the country's highest ranking, following a general upward trend, but the future doesn't look that rosy. Our Lee Ji-won has more.
Korea was the world's sixth largest exporter last year, moving up a notch from the year before, despite the sluggish global economy and low global oil prices. According to the World Trade Organization on Thursday, Korea's exports amounted to $527 billion last year, putting the country in sixth out of the 71 exporters surveyed. China topped the list with $2.27 trillion, followed by the US with $1.5 trillion and Germany with $1.3 trillion. The report says with the global economic slump and low oil prices, the world's export volume decreased by about 11% last year. But the impact was relatively less severe for Korea, which saw its exports decline 8% last year from 2014, increasing Korea's share of global export volume. Korea has been rising in the WTO's ranking in recent years. In 2008, Korea ranked 12th. It moved up to 9th the following year, and now 7 years later has gone up 6 notches to 6th. But the news isn't all good. Korea has been suffering from sluggish exports for 13 straight months since January of last year and could continue for a 14th month if the streak continues through this month. That's the longest period of decline since record-keeping began in 1970. Analysts point to the global economic slowdown and oversupply from China as the biggest culprits. And because those problems are not likely to be resolved in the short term, they expect the downward trend to continue for a while. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
Now, Iran has offered support for the first joint OPEC and non-OPEC deal in 15 years to put a ceiling on oil production. On the news, oil prices enjoyed an upswing, but it's unclear whether Tehran will join the move to freeze output at January levels because of this, analysts expect downward pressure on oil prices to continue for the time being. Kim Min-ji with this report.
Global oil prices surged on Wednesday. West Texas Intermediate spiked more than 5% to finish at over $30 a barrel, while Brent crude jumped over 7% to $34.59. The surprise uptick came after Iran voiced support for a recent agreement between crude giants Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Venezuela to freeze levels of oil production at January levels. But it remains to be seen if Iran will follow suit, as it did not offer any word, and Tehran earlier said it would boost production to regain market share after years of sanctions.
I do not believe that Iran will be willing anytime soon to agree in order to, they're not going to be willing to leave the game before they started.
Global oil prices have plunged over 70% in the past 20 months, driven by near-record production from OPEC and other producers. Analysts expect the downward pressure on oil to continue.
For one, the U.S. is not part of the deal, and it remains to be seen whether the countries that agreed to it will keep their word. Also, who is going to monitor this, and how will sanctions be imposed if it's violated? On top of that, Iran is nowhere near producing the full amount it can, as it's still subject to sanctions in some areas. When Iran reaches full capacity, the supply glut is just going to get worse.
Many analysts are on the same page that the move to freeze, not cut the output, will make little difference to the ongoing supply-demand imbalance, keeping prices from rising anytime soon. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
The United States has expressed deep concern about China's apparent move to deploy long-range surface-to-air missiles on a disputed island in the South China Sea. Satellite images appear to show 8 missile launches and a radar system on Woody Island in the Paracels. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said Washington expects to have very serious talks with China about its militarization of the South China Sea. The Pentagon has urged all countries with claims in the region to address them in accordance with international law and to commit to peacefully resolve their disputes. Japan has expressed its concern over what it says was China's unilateral move to change the status quo in the region. Tokyo says it cannot accept China's actions. Beijing claims the new facilities are limited and necessary for self-defense. An explosion near Turkey's parliament in the capital, Ankara, has left at least 28 dead and scores injured. It's the latest in a series of bomb attacks in Turkey. Park Jung-hong reports.
It's the second terror attack to hit Turkey in less than 2 months. More than 24 people have been confirmed dead and over 60 injured after a car bomb blew up in the heart of Ankara.
According to our initial findings, we have lost 28 people in an attack that was carried out using a car laden with explosives. It was detonated next to buses carrying military personnel. May their souls rest in peace with God.
The blast occurred during the evening rush hour near a busy intersection close to the parliament and other government buildings. In response, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan postponed a planned trip to Azerbaijan, and the Prime Minister also canceled a trip to Brussels. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the attack. But some security sources indicate it was the doing of Kurdish militants from the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party. Others believe Islamic State militants were responsible. Another blast was heard shortly after the car bomb, but the government says it was not another attack. Rather, it was caused by bomb experts defusing a suspicious package.
There was a second explosion in Ankara this evening, but it was not a bomb. Our security forces carried out a controlled explosion to destroy a suspicious package. I would like to stress that there's nothing to worry about.
Turkey has been facing multiple security threats over the past year. As a NATO member, it's part of a U.S.-led coalition battling the Islamic State militant group in Syria and Iraq. Also, it has been shelling Kurdish militia fighters in northern Syria. Last month, a suicide bombing in Istanbul killed 10 tourists from Germany, and last October, more than 100 people were killed when 2 suicide bombers blew themselves up outside the capital's main station. Both attacks were blamed on Islamic State. Park Jung-hong, Arirang News.
Policymakers at the US Federal Reserve are considering changing their planned path for raising rates throughout this year. According to the minutes of the Fed's January policy meeting, policymakers discussed altering their earlier views of the appropriate path for the target range for the federal funds rate. Since the decision to raise rates by 25 basis points in December, oil prices have continued to fall and global markets have been highly volatile. Now, some members said tighter economic conditions would be roughly equivalent to further hikes. With this, the Fed is considering backing away from its suggestion of raising rates 4 times this year. Many economists forecast the Fed will lift rates twice this year, possibly in June and December. Japan saw its exports tumble by the biggest margin in more than 7 years last month, largely due to the slowdown in China. The country's finance ministry says the value of Japan's overseas shipments declined nearly 13% in January from a year earlier. Imports dropped even further, 18% compared to the same period last year, leaving a $5.7 billion trade deficit. Exports to China, Japan's biggest trading partner, were down nearly 18% year on year. Well, that's all we have for now. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to our newscast, and we'll be back throughout the day with more news bulletins. Until then, goodbye.